For billions of people, the Bible isn't just a book, it's a sacred text. But have you ever stopped to wonder how confident we can be that the words we're reading today are the exact same words that were written down nearly 2,000 years ago? Well, that's what we're digging into. Professor Bart Ehrman has this great story about asking his students that very question, right in the heart of the Bible Belt. And you can probably guess what happens. Nearly every single hand in the room just shoots up. It's this deeply held belief, that the Bible's words have been perfectly protected and preserved. But that belief runs headfirst into a really fascinating and, for some, a pretty troubling historical problem.
So what's the problem? It's this. We don't actually have the original documents. Not the one Matthew wrote, not Mark's, not Luke's, not John's, not a single letter from Paul. They're gone. What we have are copies, and copies of copies, made centuries later.
That's right. The number of original manuscripts, the ones scholars call the autographs, the actual scrolls the authors wrote on, that have survived to this day is a big round zero. They were probably read and passed around until they just fell apart or were lost to time. And this is so crucial to get. Every Bible you've ever picked up is a translation of copies, not of the originals. Now, while the originals are gone, what we do have is just an absolute treasure trove of copies. I mean, over 5,700 manuscripts in the original Greek alone, and that's not even counting the thousands more in other ancient languages like Latin and Coptic. This gives scholars a massive amount of data to work with, but it also, as you can imagine, creates a whole new set of challenges. Which leads to the really important question. In a world with no printing presses, no photocopiers, and definitely no PDF files, how did you duplicate a book? Well, you had to do it by hand, one letter at a time. And right there, in that manual process, is where things start to get really complicated. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like a giant game of telephone, but one that's being played across centuries and continents. You know how a story changes just a little bit with each person who tells it? Well, the transmission of these texts was kind of like that. So the key thing to understand is that errors build on each other. Imagine a scribe makes a few little mistakes in his copy. Then, years later, someone else comes along and copies that manuscript. Well, they're going to faithfully reproduce all the first scribe's mistakes and then probably add a few new ones of their own. You repeat that process for hundreds of years, and you can see how different versions of the text would start to drift apart. And you've got to remember the context here. We're talking about the Roman Empire, where the vast majority of people, we're talking something like 90%, could not read or write. So the folks doing the copying weren't all, highly trained professionals. Their skill, their attention to detail, even their basic spelling ability, it was all over the map. This time gap is also a really big deal. The books were written in the 1st century, right? But our very first piece of physical evidence is this tiny little fragment, about the size of a credit card, from around the year 125. We don't get any large, though still incomplete manuscripts until around the year 200. That's more than 100 years of copying happening before our surviving evidence even starts. Okay, so all these changes that crept into the manuscripts, they weren't all the same. Scholars pretty much group them into two major categories. You've got your simple accidental slips, and then you've got your deliberate intentional alterations. On the one hand, you have the purely accidental mistakes. A scribe is tired, he misspells a word, or his eye just skips a line. Super common. But on the other hand, you have intentional changes. This is where a scribe basically acts like an editor, changing the text to fix what he thinks is a factual error, or maybe to make it line up a little better with his own theological ideas. Here's a classic example of an accidental mistake. It's called parablapsis. Imagine two lines of text that end with the exact same word. A scribe copies the first line, looks back at the page to find his place, but his eye accidentally lands on the second time that word appears. So he just continues copying from there, completely leaving out the entire chunk of text in between. Whoops. And for an intentional fix, a great example is right at the beginning of Mark's Gospel. Early copies say a quote is from Isaiah the prophet, but it's actually from Exodus. Later scribes noticed this little mix-up and, probably trying to be helpful, they just changed the text to the more general "in the prophets." It smooths over the problem, sure, but it also changes what was originally written. So this is the big question, right? A few spelling mistakes here, a minor correction there. Does it really matter? Are there any changes that actually affect entire stories or even core beliefs?
Well, the answer is a definite yes. I mean, come on, you know this one. It's from one of the most famous and beloved stories in the Gospels, Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. This line is just this incredibly powerful statement about mercy and a total takedown of self-righteousness. It's absolutely iconic. But there's a huge twist to this beautiful story, because when scholars dig into the best and oldest historical evidence we have, they come to a pretty startling conclusion. The evidence against it being original is just overwhelming. The story is completely missing from our oldest and most reliable manuscripts of John. The writing style in the original Greek is totally different from the rest of the book. It sticks out like a sore thumb. And early church fathers who wrote these massive commentaries on the Gospel of John, they never mention it. It seems to be a powerful story that a later scribe just decided to add into the text. And that's not the only major addition. The Gospel of Mark, in our earliest copies, has this shockingly abrupt ending. The women find the empty tomb. They're told to go tell the disciples what happened, but instead, they freak out, they run away in terror, and they say nothing to anyone. The end. That's it. Later scribes apparently found this so unsatisfying that they added the final 12 verses we're all familiar with, the ones that include appearances of the resurrected Jesus. Sometimes, even a single word can change the entire feeling of a story. In Mark chapter 1, a leper comes up to Jesus. Most of the manuscripts we have say that Jesus felt compassion for him, but some of our very early and reliable copies say he got angry. Now, scholars often think angry is more likely to be the original, because why would a scribe change the text to make Jesus sound harsher? It's much more likely they'd soften a difficult reading. So with thousands of copies and hundreds of thousands of differences, you might be thinking this all sounds like a hopeless mess. How can we know anything at all? But it's not just chaos. It's actually the raw material for this incredible field of historical detective work. This work is called textual criticism, and these specialists, they spend their entire lives comparing these manuscripts, identifying every little difference, and then using a set of clear, reasoned principles to figure out which version is most likely the oldest one. It's a painstaking science, but the goal is to get as close as we possibly can to the words that were first written down. So, let's wrap this up. What's the main takeaway here? Well, first, we don't have the originals, only thousands of copies. Second, those copies have hundreds of thousands of differences, from tiny typos to entire added stories. And finally, this doesn't erase the Bible's importance, not at all, but it does reveal its very dynamic, very human history. It forces us to engage with it not as some static, faxed-from-heaven book, but as a collection of documents copied, changed, and preserved by human hands for centuries. And that leaves us with a huge final question. It's not one with an easy answer, but it really gets to the heart of what it means to read these ancient texts today. Understanding their history might not give us all the answers, but it sure does change the questions we ask.